absolute weapon of the Third Reich. A steel fortress on tracks, its 200mm armor impenetrable to any Soviet shell, with a gun that could knock out tanks from 3 kilometers away. This machine was created to turn the tide of the war. Its name was Ferdinand. But its real story is one of the most foolish and costly miscalculations in the history of tank design. What if the designers of this titan forgot to install a machine gun? That's exactly right. The impenetrable colossus died in droves in close combat because it was completely defenseless against infantry with grenades. This shameful error had to be urgently fixed, birthing a mutant machine with a different name. You'll learn how the brilliant, ahead-of-its-time electromechanical transmission became a nightmare for mechanics, how German crews, terrified, reported thousands of Ferdinands when there were less than 100, and how one such self-propelled gun held off an entire American tank division single-handed for 10 hours, only for similar machines to later burn ingloriously in the narrow streets of Berlin. This is the story of how brilliant technology was crushed by tactical insanity, and how faith in armor and power lost to simple soldiers' ingenuity and sheer numbers. The truth of the legendary Ferdinand is in this episode. By the winter of 1941, the war on the Eastern Front gave the German command an unpleasant surprise. The steel fists of the Blitzkrieg, the PZ-3 and PZ-4 tanks had met an unforeseen obstacle. Soviet T-34 medium tanks, with their sloped armor and powerful 76mm gun, were formidable foes. But the real shock came from the heavy KV-1 tanks, whose armor often proved impenetrable to standard German shells, even at close range. An adequate answer was needed, a new, fundamentally better protected and armed machine to restore supremacy in armored duels. In response, a fierce rivalry unfolded in Germany between 2 design schools. On one side, the Henschel Company, offering a proven evolutionary path. On the other, the brilliant engineer and Hitler's favorite, Ferdinand Porsche, always inclined toward bold, revolutionary solutions. His project, designated VK45.01P, was a technological marvel for its time. Its core was a unique electromechanical transmission. 2 Maybach gasoline engines didn't drive the sprockets directly. Instead, they powered massive generators. The electricity they produced fed separate electric motors connected to each track's drive sprockets. This scheme, reminiscent of modern hybrid powertrains, promised fantastic handling ease. The driver could smoothly control the speed and direction of each track by simply turning a steering wheel like a ship's captain. Porsche was so confident in his idea's superiority that, ignoring caution, he ordered the serial production of hulls and chassis before the State Commission's final decision. Factories were forging what he believed would be his triumph. However, in June 1942, high-ranking officers, having assessed both projects, delivered a dry, pragmatic verdict. The winner of the tender was the Henschel tank, the future legend, the Tiger. Decisive arguments were reliability and repairability in the field. Porsche's complex electrical system, requiring highly skilled mechanics and vulnerable to dust, moisture, or overload, was deemed too risky for the vast Russian expanses. It was a crushing blow to the designer's ambitions. In warehouses, 90 fully completed but utterly useless chassis worth a fortune gathered dust. Enormous resources had been wasted. It was at this moment, when the project seemed dead, that the main client, Adolf Hitler rendered his verdict. The Führer, who loved grand and impressive projects, could not accept such waste. He personally ordered a worthy use be found for these chassis. And the solution, born of military necessity and a desire to save face, was truly devilish. Why not create not a tank, but a mobile armored fortress on this super-strong chassis? Engineers were tasked with removing the turret, welding additional armor of unprecedented thickness, 200 millimeters of steel, onto the front hull, and mounting the most powerful anti-tank gun of the time, the 88 millimeter PaK-43 with a 71 caliber barrel, in a fixed casement. And so, from the ashes of an ambitious but rejected tank, a new, even more fearsome monster began to rise, named after its creator, Ferdinand. The designers, given an unexpected chance at redemption, enthusiastically set to work, never suspecting that a fatal and glaring flaw was already baked into the very essence of their salvaged project, a flaw that would doom it to a terrible fate. By April 1943, 91 monstrous creations saw the light of day. What the military saw was staggering. The Ferdinand wasn't just a tank, it was a mobile iron fort. Its frontal armor, reaching 200 millimeters, was the thickest on the battlefield at the time, making it nearly invulnerable head-on to any Allied anti-tank gun. Its armament matched its protection. The long-barreled 88 millimeter PaK-43 gun could pierce the armor of any Soviet tank from 2 kilometers away, turning crews into hostages of a hopeless fight. The electromechanical transmission inherited from Porsche's project gave the 65-ton behemoth unexpected agility for its size. The controls were intuitive and smooth. But this advanced system hid hidden dangers. It was complex, temperamental, and prone to overheating under heavy use, especially in summer heat. Field repairs required the highest skill, and the vehicle itself, due to its monstrous weight, had a low top speed, about 22 miles per hour on roads, a tiny operational range, and colossal ground pressure, making it vulnerable on soft ground and marshland. But all this paled before one glaring, inexplicable error baked into the design. In their pursuit of invulnerability from tanks, the engineers completely overlooked the threat at close range. The Ferdinand was not equipped with a single machine gun, not a bow gun, not an anti-aircraft gun. This 65-ton, well-armed fortress was utterly defenseless against infantry, who could approach it with impunity. It was a fatal miscalculation that contradicted all the canons of tank design. Nevertheless, the Wehrmacht command, impressed by the new machine's power, formed 2 elite heavy anti-tank battalions from them, the 653rd and 654th. Crews made up of experienced tankers underwent intensive training, learning to handle the temperamental transmission and use the gun's incredible range. They were assigned a special, almost mystical role in the upcoming grand operation meant to turn the tide on the Eastern Front. The Ferdinands were to be the impenetrable battering ram that would shatter the world's deepest and most prepared defenses. Their first and greatest test was Kursk. Operation Citadel was the Ferdinand's finest hour and the beginning of its end simultaneously. On the northern face of the Kursk bulge, near the Ponyri station, these steel colossi were thrown into the inferno. Their task was devilishly simple and complex: to lead the charge, absorbing the main fire, and use the power of their guns to crush Soviet fortifications, paving the way for infantry and regular tanks. The first days of battle, July 9th and 10th, seemed like a triumph of German engineering. The Ferdinands crept forward slowly but relentlessly. Shells from Soviet 45mm and 76mm guns rang loudly off their frontal armor, causing no harm. Their long-range 88mm guns methodically knocked out strong points, destroyed artillery crews, and disabled tanks before they could even get within effective return fire range. Crews reported dozens of destroyed targets. The plan seemed to be working perfectly. But it soon became clear that the Soviet command had its own, much simpler and more terrifying answer to the German Titans. The entire area in front of the defenses was densely mined, and here the Ferdinand's weight and lack of agility played a cruel trick. The heavy machines, following narrow, cleared paths, began hitting mines. Tracks were torn, road wheels shattered. The huge shell-proof fortress instantly became a stationary target, stuck in the middle of the battlefield. And here, that fatal flaw revealed itself. Soviet assault groups rushed toward the immobilized giants, who couldn't fight back even with pistols. Soldiers with grenades, Molotov cocktails, and anti-tank rifles could approach practically with impunity. They threw Molotov cocktails onto the engine deck grills, tossed grenades into hatches open for evacuation. Some crews desperately fought back with small arms, but against organized infantry, it was like trying to stop an avalanche with a pistol. Soviet artillery also found its weapon. Heavy 203mm B-4 howitzers were brought to bear. Their high-explosive shells, weighing 100 weight, couldn't pierce the 200mm armor outright, but the monstrous force of the explosion crumpled steel plates, jammed guns, and concussed or incapacitated crews from the sheer shockwave alone. The field near Ponieri became a graveyard for Ferdinands. Dozens of vehicles were knocked out, most falling victim not to tank duels, but to mines and close infantry attacks. The Battle of Kursk dispelled the myth of the invincible wonder weapon. The Ferdinand proved too specialized, unwieldy, and vulnerable for frontal assaults. However, its firepower and armor were too valuable to simply write off. The surviving machines awaited urgent modification and a new, more suitable role on completely different fronts. While one part of the Ferdinands burned in the steel hell near Ponieri, another, the 653rd Heavy Anti-Tank Battalion, fought in different conditions. Near the village of Teploye, the terrain was more open, and Soviet defenses were less saturated with deadly minefields. Here, the Ferdinands could finally implement the very tactics envisioned by Porsche's geniuses. They occupied dominant heights and, like virtuoso snipers, methodically picked off Soviet tanks and strongpoints from ranges where they couldn't even properly see the enemy. Their 88mm shells, like messengers of relentless fate, found targets from over 2 kilometers away. The battalion's losses here were incomparably lower than their comrades on the northern face, but the nature of these losses was telling. Machines broke down after hitting mines, getting stuck in unsuitable terrain, or being damaged by massed artillery fire. Even in relatively successful conditions, armor was no panacea. When the last shots echoed over the Kursk Bulge in August 1943, the Wehrmacht headquarters began tallying the bitter results. The numbers were disheartening. Out of 89 machines thrown into battle, 39 were total losses. And a detailed analysis revealed a shocking truth. The lion's share of these losses came not from heroic tank duels, but from prosaic, lowly weapons of war, anti-tank and even anti-personnel mines, grenades, and Molotov cocktails delivered with impunity to the giants by Soviet infantry. It became abundantly clear that technical superiority was nothing without tactical sense. A machine created for duels at kilometer ranges was completely defenseless in close combat. The absence of a machine gun, which might have seemed an acceptable compromise during design, became a fatal and absurd error on the battlefield, costing many crews their lives. To admit a mistake is to get a chance to correct it. In the autumn of 1943, the surviving Ferdinands were recalled from the front line and sent not to the scrapyard, but to the Alket assembly plant for urgent and radical modernization. This wasn't a cosmetic fix, but surgical intervention that changed the machine's very philosophy. Finally, a port was added to the front hull plate, housing a standard MG-34 machine gun. This simple solution immediately deprived infantry of the ability to approach with impunity. A new, rotating commander's cupola with vision devices was mounted on the massive casement roof, drastically improving the crew's visibility and situational awareness. The machine that underwent this modernization received a new official name, Elephant, symbolizing both power and now the means to defend against hunters. The corrected monster, having gained sight and tusks, was ready for battle again. But this time, it wouldn't face the endless Russian steppes, but entirely different landscapes and opponents who would test its resilience from a new angle. Fate sent the modernized elephants to different fronts, as if testing what they were truly capable of in radically different conditions. One part, namely the 1st Company of the 653rd Battalion with 11 machines, was loaded onto trains in early 1944 and sent to the Apennine Peninsula. In Italy, a critical situation had developed. The Allies, having landed at Anzio, created a bridgehead and threatened to break through to Rome. The German command needed any means to plug mountain passes and valleys. And here, among rocky slopes and defiles, the Elephant unexpectedly found its niche. Mountainous terrain was its best ally. The machine, too slow for maneuver warfare, proved ideal for static defense. It could take a position on a slope, becoming a nearly invulnerable long-term firing point with incredible engagement range. The apotheosis of such use was the legendary Battle of March 30th to 31st, 1944, near the highway to Rome. Two elephants, skillfully positioned on high ground, held off fierce attacks by superior forces of the U.S. 1st Armored Division for 10 hours. The Allies, with dozens of Sherman tanks, tried to flank the position, suppress it with artillery, but to no avail. The long-range 88mm guns methodically knocked out one target after another. According to American reports, they lost over 30 vehicles in that fight, failing to dislodge the German elephants from their position. It was a flawless example of how equipment, finding its tactical niche, unlocks its full potential. However, on the Eastern Front, where the remaining machines were sent, a much grimmer reality reigned. In the spring of 1944, the elephants of the 653rd Battalion found themselves in the cauldron of battles near Ternopil. Here, there was no time to occupy ideal positions. Soviet troops attacked wave after wave, and the heavy tank destroyers were thrown into counterattacks or used as a mobile reserve to plug breakthroughs. The intensity of combat was extreme. Under such conditions, all the old ailments resurfaced: overburdened repair services, vulnerability in rough terrain, the difficulty of evacuation of disabled 65-ton machines. In a few weeks of bloody clashes, the battalion lost 14 tank destroyers, many of which were not destroyed, but simply abandoned due to the impossibility of repair or recovery under fire. The situation was saved only by the battalion's unique Bergpanther recovery vehicles and special tractors based on the Porsche Tiger chassis, whose crews worked at the limits of human capability, returning seemingly hopeless machines to service. By the autumn of 1944, even for the German command, it became clear that the time of such one-off, temperamental, and resource-intensive monsters as the Elephant was irrevocably passing. The 653rd Battalion, which had become a sort of museum of heavy tank destroyers, began receiving new monsters, Jagdtigers, with even more powerful 128mm guns. The Elephants were gradually withdrawn from the front line. From the surviving machines, a separate 614th Heavy Tank Destroyer Company was formed. It was these last veterans, having endured the fire of Kursk, the mud of Ukraine, and the stones of Italy, who were to fight their final, most desperate battle in the very heart of the Third Reich, where they would face the enemy they feared most, the new generation of Soviet heavy tanks. By the start of 1945, there was no place left for the surviving Elephants in elite battalions being re-equipped with the latest Jagdtigers. From these veterans who had survived the fire of Kursk, the mud of Ukraine, and the stones of Italy, a separate, almost makeshift unit was formed, the 614th Heavy Anti-Tank Company. It was thrown onto the most critical direction, into Poland, near the city of Kielce, where the troops of Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front were preparing for the decisive push west. And here, on the approaches to Germany, a meeting took place for which the German crews were psychologically unprepared. In their path stood not the familiar T-34-85s or Lend-Lease Shermans, but new, fearsome Soviet heavy tanks, the IS-2, Joseph Stalin. This was the first opponent that didn't just threaten the Elephant from the flanks or the air, but could challenge it to a duel head-on. The long 122mm D-25T gun, firing a massive armor-piercing shell, posed a real threat even to the famous 200mm of frontal armor at ranges up to a kilometer. Suddenly, the Elephant lost its main tactical advantage, the feeling of invulnerability from the front. The battles near Kielce turned into tense sniper duels. German gunners tried with all their might to hit the Soviet heavy tanks from maximum range before they could close the distance for a sure shot. Each such duel was a nerve-wracking game of survival. After the failure to hold back the offensive, the remnants of the company, melting away, were pushed back towards Berlin itself. Their final mission was to participate in the street battles for the capital of the Third Reich, the worst possible nightmare for such a machine. In the chaos of destroyed blocks, among rubble and barricades, the 65-ton unwieldy colossus with limited gun traverse became easy prey. It could be set on fire by a Panzerfaust from a second-story window, blown up by a booby trap, or shot point-blank by a gun hidden in the ruins. Firepower and fortress-like armor meant nothing in this hell. The last Elephants were destroyed or abandoned by their crews on the streets and squares of the doomed city. Their war, which began with grand plans to turn the tide of battles, ended here in useless and inglorious agony. But while the last mangled hulls of these machines cooled on the cobblestones of Berlin, Others of their kin, captured intact on the Kursk Bulge and later, began a completely different, peaceful, and highly useful service. They became not enemies, but invaluable teachers and test subjects for Soviet military engineers. The Soviet Union acquired at least 8 captured Ferdinands and elephants. These machines became not museum exhibits, but invaluable objects for research. They were subjected to comprehensive study. Engineers took apart the complex electromechanical transmission, bolt by bolt, trying to understand its potential and weak points. The armor was methodically shot at with guns of all calibers, from 45mm guns to heavy 122mm and 152mm howitzers, compiling detailed reports on penetration and resilience. Every weld, every design element was carefully examined, and the conclusions formed the basis for new developments and manuals on combating heavy armor. It was these post-war studies and archival data that helped dispel many myths that, like smoke after battle, had shrouded this machine's history. The first myth concerns the name. Both names, Ferdinand and Elephant, were official. The first stuck to the early machines, the second to the modernized ones with the machine gun and commander's cupula. The second and most important myth is about its main nemesis. It wasn't the legendary Su-152s, nicknamed Zveroboy, animal hunters, nor aircraft that became the main killers of Ferdinands on the Kursk Bulge. They turned out to be simple, mass-produced, and terrifyingly effective means: minefields, grenades in the hands of infantry, and heavy howitzer fire against the running gear. The third myth is about scale. In veterans' memoirs and Soviet reports, hundreds of Ferdinands were mentioned. In reality, only 91 were ever built. This discrepancy is a testament to how deeply the name Ferdinand was etched into the Red Army soldiers' consciousness as a symbol of the most fearsome German technology, becoming a generic term for any large self-propelled gun. Thus, the Ferdinand remains in history as the most contradictory symbol of German military engineering: a concentration of advanced technology, phenomenal gun power, and unprecedented armor protection. It had it all. But these virtues were nullified by fatal miscalculations: tactical illiteracy in its use for frontal assaults, a glaring design omission, lack of a machine gun, and monstrous operational complexity. Its fate is a vivid lesson that in war, ultimately, victory belongs not to the most technologically advanced or best protected weapon, but to the one that is balanced, reliable, mass-produced, and used within its strengths. The Ferdinand became a monument to an era where gigantania and reliance on wonder weapons were defeated by mass production, simplicity, and tactical flexibility.